Hello, hello. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We had several folks that were actually in the waiting room, and Zoom takes a little bit for everybody to come in. I'm going to give it just a little bit of time just to make sure everybody is who was in the waiting room is actually in. I am Zach Duke. I'm actually a CEO and founder of FFIEC. I'll be your fearless leader today. Appreciate you spending some time. Maybe you're in the middle of lunch. Maybe you're wishing you had a longer lunch. Maybe you're thinking it sounds like it's breakfast time, depending on where you are. Um, uh, my goal today is to keep you entertained, make it educational, and give you some opportunity to understand really kind of what's going on with the cat sunset and really the 1 year from the sunset, really what we're seeing in the industry and the options associated. A couple of kind of housekeeping items. First off, we're going to have chat. So for those of you who have not seen me speak, I love the heckling. You're allowed to jump in. You can ask questions via the chat. Usually I'm good about trying to see them, not always, just because I'll kind of get on a path. But if you're like me, if I don't document what the question was, I forget it. My two brain cells, they like to fight. And next thing you know, I don't remember. So I just want to encourage you to use the chat in the bottom of Zoom if you're not a Zoom regular user. And to kick that off as a to-do, this is crazy. I'm just north of Atlanta, Georgia, and we started school this week. So a couple of questions for you. One is, when do you start school? And does that sound crazy, starting the first week of August? Put that in the chat. And then secondarily, I'll be talking through this a little bit as we kind of talk through today. If you could go back to a specific year of school, what year would it be? So I'll give y'all just a few minutes to use the chat. Y'all just may leave me hanging where you're not going to actually put it in the chat because you're like, what is he talking about? So I'll go first on the first off, I think it's crazy that we start in August for school. That is hands down just a little bit crazy. And then secondarily, the year I would not go back to is for sure middle school. I think I probably would choose 11th or 12th grade if I had to go from that side. So for those of you who are jumping in and joining us and you're like, I thought I was going to talk about the cat sunset, I was asking a couple of questions, really kind of as icebreakers for us to get kicked off and started. Let's see. It looks like Bradley, appreciate you going through. Yeah, third week in August. That sounds much more reasonable to me than the first week of August for start date. But anyway, all right, let me get kicked off. What to expect? So first off, we're going to talk about what we're hearing in the industry, specifically with the cybersecurity assessment tool Sunset. We're going to give you some pros and cons, really kind of what are the options and what are the pros and the cons of those options. We're going to talk about the history of the cybersecurity assessment, really around why the history is important as we go forward. And then we're going to talk through the FFIEC CAT and really kind of our replacement strategy for that. So if you're joining us, maybe some of these questions or this thought process has kind of where you are. So the concept of what we're hearing is really kind of twofold. So there were a lot of institutions that went in August of last year. They did the FFIEC CAT, and they're like, I just bought myself 12 months, but now they got to do something. That may be where you are. We've also had conversations with folks where they're going through exams or even audits, and the examiners are wanting an inherent risk process, a way for them to be able to categorize. Or you're partway through CRI or NIST, and there's a lot of similarity between CRI and NIST as we talk through today, and you're just finding out it's complicated, or it's really hard to get everything to be full or complete or yes, going back to the way the questions were on the maturity for the FFIEC CAT. Executive reporting has been a challenge on just how do I go present this to a board? It's a new thing. Like, what does that process look like? This probably doesn't shock you. I think this is probably me preaching to the choir. It's more work than I was expecting. That's a pretty consistent challenge that we see. And then really, like, what do the regulators really want? What are they expecting? I obviously want to make sure that I'm addressing that as part of it. So hopefully some of those pieces resonated as I was kind of talking through on the pieces that we're hearing. And we're going to talk through the process and the dynamic associated. So in case you're coming into this and maybe you're new to the industry and you're not even sure what's going on, you're trying to get your arms around it. Most of you probably already know, but the FFIEC CAT, there was a statement that came out where it was sunset effective. So the last time you could use it was August of last year. It's a 12-month trend. So essentially what ends up happening is if you haven't replaced it, you have to do something. And if you're stuck in those scenarios we talked through, really, there were some options. And as we've been educating and talking through the FFIEC CAT, really for almost 2 years now, it seems like, from when that initial review came out, there's been a place to kind of go back and talk about the history of the CAT. So for those of you that don't know, it was actually implemented all the way back in 2015. That's a little bit more than 10 years ago. And when it first came out, it was a massive pain. Now, what's really interesting, we've seen kind of statistically in the conversations we've been having with bankers like you, is about 60% of the people that are responsible for the plan associated with the sunset of the CAT were not involved in the first year when the FFIEC CAT came out. So for those of you that were, you're thinking, gosh, you were lucky. You missed a lot of pain. For those of you that weren't, I think understanding the challenges associated and just kind of the history and the precursor of what happened, I think is really important. So the last update to the FFIEC CAT was all the way back in 2017. That's been a pretty significant amount of time. And I like to use this picture and just kind of show. So this is a picture of my family back in 2017. We were, I think this was actually July 4th of 2017. So you'll see my oldest daughter, Grace, middle daughter, Lola, at the time, little guy, Rick, and then my wife, Melody. And then here's the new picture. And I use this to really kind of highlight, like, since 2017 has been a long time. So first off, there's a new addition. There's this little guy up here. So Melody and I actually just celebrated 25 years. And yes, that is our little guy. He is 4 going on 40. Holy smokes, there's a whole story there. Rick is now taller than me, or I'm standing in a hole, one of the two. I think I prefer to say I'm standing in a hole. Grace is now 21. Lola, my middle one, is 19. And I use that one as just to kind of highlight, like, holy smokes, the changes that have happened in the last 10 years. And when you think about cybersecurity and kind of get you off the picture of the family dynamic, what's changed? Well, ransomware, APIs, AI, the risks associated. When we used to talk about antivirus, now we're talking about XDR, MDR, EDR, the list goes on. So the functionalities of the solutions, things that you're actually rolling out, like real-time payments, the list goes on associated. So the technology change has been massive. And since the FFIEC CAT hasn't been updated since 2017, it created a gap. That's really why the regulators had to figure out something to do in the sunset. Now, going back in time, again, for those of you who are maybe in the 60% quadrant and weren't involved with the first year of the FFIEC CAT, this is really important to understand. The regulators actually stance was the FFIEC CAT was optional. Now, in reality, it really wasn't. You had to go figure out something that was as good or better than what they had as a solution. And just about, and I don't want to use absolutes, but just about every community bank and institution that I've talked with has used the FFIEC CAT. And it really became the industry de facto. But the verbiage of the regulators coming in and saying, this is optional, you can choose your own way. There's a lot of similarities in the challenge that creates and the question marks associated. But the fact of the matter is it was not optional. Now, this process, I actually use in information security discussions. This is actually a snapshot from the FFIEC CAT. And I wanted to start with this because it's a really good way to think about how should you manage information security and cybersecurity governance. So the first step that they have is assess maturity and inherent risk, kind of understand where you are, identify your gaps, determine your desired state of maturity, get a plan to attain and sustain it, and then this reevaluate. And this arrow right here, I think, is critical. This is not just I'm done. This becomes a recurring theme. There's a frequency and a dynamic that's associated for these processes. And as I think through the structure of the FFIEC CAT and just going back in time, this chart, and if you haven't kind of read up, this is actually part of the FFIEC guidance that came out with the cybersecurity assessment tool. This was one of the biggest advantages of the FFIEC CAT. And essentially the 500 questions that you answer, starting with inherent risk, allows for you to be able to go and say, where are you from a risk perspective, or institution inherent risk is really the better way to say that, from least to most. And it's interesting. I've had a lot of conversations through the years, and I've been doing this a long time. The initially most executive leaders were sitting in this like, oh, we're a small community bank, we're going to be least. When in reality, they were between minimal, moderate, or moderate on their side. So now the advantage of this is, especially on the executive and the senior level leadership standpoint, I don't have to understand all 500 questions. I can actually say, well, what's our risk level? And then I just need to be in the blue. So if we're in moderate, I need to be between evolving and advanced. So it took a really complicated process, a lot of questions, a lot of documentation, and it simplified that process. So one of the advantages in this was the kind of the executive reporting and kind of the understanding, and looking back as part of that. So the good, if I could kind of summarize, one is the cybersecurity assessment tool, the FFIEC CAT, was examiner trusted. It was the industry standard. Everyone was using this process. That inherent risk process, kind of think of going from least to most and being able to go kind of quantify to create your executive reporting was critical. And then for those of you who were not involved in the beginning, holy smokes, has it gotten easier over time. You can actually go and say, well, last year, what did I answer? Okay, let's just worry about what the questions and what's changed. You're not having to start from scratch. And that process was really good. Now, the gaps is clearly it's the dated infrequent updates. So again, think of those pictures of my family and just like what's changed, and think about the technology processes with things in just the rapid pace of innovation, especially with where we're sitting in today's world. So the new technology risks. Additionally, the one of the gaps that was really critical in the FFIEC CAT is it didn't tie into your other risk assessments. It didn't tie into, it was just another task or another process that you had to go through to be able to facilitate. So the next piece I want to kind of change gears and talk about kind of post history is really around the concepts of what the pros and cons of are with what the regulators gave us. So these are the 4 options that were actually put into the guidance. And we're going to go through each of these in depth, but essentially there's NIST, there's CRI, CISA Financial Services, and then CIS controls. And the first is NIST. So NIST framework, there was a major update where it went from the initial version of the NIST cybersecurity framework to NIST 2.0. The big difference in NIST 2.0 is they added this govern section. And as a company that created a governance platform to be able to help kind of document, we're 100% aligned on that need and that process. So the framework. Now, NIST was created and is owned by the Department of Homeland Security. It rolls up through kind of the federal government. So what you end up having is this dynamic of being able to go understand kind of where you are from an infrastructure standpoint, or specifically around, and it's supposed to be a common framework, but it's not financial institution specific. Additionally, it doesn't have an inherent risk. It's really just the controls. So going back to your existing processes that you have with the FFIEC CAT, it's really looking at the maturity statements. Those maturity statements are controls as we go forward, to kind of map the words. But there isn't a way to go and say, well, I'm not the same as a Bank of America or a Chase. I need to have a right size process. There's not a way to be able to kind of go through and define that. It is a very thorough, it is absolutely an industry standard. Kind of de facto, it lacks kind of executive reporting, which is a challenge, especially if you're like most of the institutions I talk with and are dealing with, where executive leadership, and for sure the board, you're lucky if you have one or one person, maybe there's two that kind of understand technology, but this lack of cybersecurity kind of understanding, it creates some unique challenges that we have to deal with. But NIST is a new process, and it can be very complicated to implement, specifically around, they have this concept of full and partial. And to get the full, a lot of times it creates a lot of work and effort. And the way the questions are worded, it's almost like you feel like you need to say, you can't say yes, like in the old way, or you can't say full, you actually have to say partial. So then it creates this work of, well, gosh, what do I need to do to close the gap on that associated? So again, really thorough, industry standard, just not financial institution specific. The next one is CRI, and CRI is a financial institution specific one. It leverages NIST. It actually expands on the controls associated with that. It is a maturity model. So it's designed to be able to have this, not all banks are the same kind of mindset. And I'm going to talk through that in just a second. But it can absolutely be complicated to implement. You have that same kind of full, partial, the listing in the process associated. It doesn't have executive reporting by default. For sure, it's a new process, something else we have to kind of go through and kind of get our team to understand, and then be able to report on from an executive standpoint. And then inherent risk is no longer available. What they do have is these impact tiers or levels. So there are 4 levels. The 4 levels are kind of listed here, where you have tier 1 is national and supranational notice impact. So really what they're doing is they're quantifying the size of the organization, the amount of processing that you're doing, to be able to say what's the industry impact. So rather than with the inherent risk profile that we have with the FFIEC CAT, it actually went in and said, what type of solutions do you have? How risky are you based on your characteristics, not just size? So these are all size questions. And as you go through, you've got the mega banks as tier 1. Then you go to subnational impact. And then tier 3 is sector impact, and 4 is localized impact. And really the question that we really dove in as we've reviewed this is, what's the difference between level 4 and level 3? And it's massive. So to go and have your institution be tier 3 or level 3, essentially one of 2 things has to be true. Either you have to have 1% of the transactions in the US. Holy smokes, that's a lot of transactions. Or you have to have over 1 million customers. So based on my kind of calculations, and of course there's not a direct correlation to this, that's at least a $50 billion institution, if not bigger. So it essentially put a big bucket of folks where your size is all the same. So if you're a $750 million or a $2 billion bank, you're being looked at as a bank that has 1% of the transactions and 1 million customers. And really that massiveness is different in the characteristics in the process. And that's a challenge that we saw as part of this. And if you contrast that versus what was in the FFIEC CAT, there were questions around, how do you do delivery? Things like payments and processes. What are your external threats? What type of solutions do you have in place today? The organizational characteristics, and even your technology and connection types. So really the question that we see as part of this, is it just size and complexity, or do we also need to look at just size. So size and complexity really gets into what the impact tiers or the inherent risk was versus the impact tiers. So create some kind of challenges associated. The next option was CISA Financial Services. And with CISA Financial Services, essentially that working group has been sunset by executive order. Now, there are critical infrastructure sector-specific groups and controls associated. They just don't have the depth to be really transparent. So that option really, we thought may be an option when the regulatory guidance came out, really is not based on where we sit today. And the last option is CIS controls. Now, these are very specific technical controls. Actually, I would say it's great for you to be able to sit down with your technology manager, your leader, or your managed service provider and be able to get yes, no. One of the things that's a challenge is the implementation groups don't match banking. So you can't go and say, I'm just going to be implementation group 1. And that's what IG1 is. Or I'm just going to be implementation group 2. It really is a blend, because if you just do implementation group 1 thinking, well, I'll just be baseline, like what was in the FFIEC CAT, in reality, you got some exposure from an examination standpoint just on what the examiners are going to expect. So it didn't directly correlate, for lack of a better term. Executive reporting is a change. It's a change in process and creates some kind of challenges because you don't have that inherent risk profile. You don't have a way to kind of tune it and be able to talk about what do I need to have, et cetera, from there. So, and these are some examples of those 18 kind of control sections and what they ask questions around specifically. So ultimately, when this guidance came out, and one of the things we like to do at FFIEC is when regulatory guidance and expectations come out, we like to do this crazy concept of saying, okay, well, based on that, what should we do from an innovation standpoint? And as I was talking through those 4 options, none of those jumped off the charts and we're like, gosh, that's the clear and obvious scenario. And it took us back to one of the things that we went through is an innovation process back in 2021 through the ICBA Think Tech, where we were able to go meet with 150 banks in 90 days. It was awesome. Just a great process to go through and understand what are the challenges that the community bankers have. What are the things that they have in place today? How do we simplify that? And it really defined product for us. And we took that same concept when we saw this FFIEC CAT to say, gosh, what should we change? What are the processes associated that we need to think through to make this more effective and really kind of address these challenges? And really, we came out with a process on our side of these goals. And these goals, I think are pretty straightforward, but it really became the guiding light. So the first piece is we wanted to make sure that we meet or met the regulatory expectations. Obviously, the regulators coming in, we wanted to make sure that process. We also wanted to make the process easy to implement and reduce the time associated to complete the process of, gosh, this is something new. We wanted to keep the institution inherent risk profile a way for you to be able to go quantify the risk based on your complexity, not just size. We wanted to maintain a process for right size maturity. So you're implementing it as a institution with your risks and processes, but not having these huge buckets of institutions that could be, again, 50, 60, 70 billion in assets and all being in the same block. And at a minimum, we wanted to maintain executive reporting. So those became our guiding light in our process as we went through this kind of innovation cycle of, again, our inner workings is we love to combine in the same sentence, crazy concept of regulatory changes, regulatory expectations, and innovation, and combine the two of those. So as we went through our process, really what we ended up doing is a couple of different things. So I had the ICBA as part of that. We actually were able to go work with the ICBA to get in front of the regulators, to talk and have conversations with them. We actually met with the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, the OCC. We actually trained 86 state regulators on the process that we went through. So was able to get a feedback loop, but also be able to go back and say, hey, here's actually the plan. And our process was very intentional. The first thing that we do is we import your existing FFIEC CAT to make the process easy. So, and I mentioned before, for those of you who are in the 40% that were involved in year one, you already know that last year's FFIEC CAT was foundationally different than the first year that you went through the FFIEC CAT. There's no question. And it's because you had the answers from the previous year. So one of the things that we were able to go do is really create a process where we can leverage your last FFIEC CAT as a reference point. We also wanted to be able to map the inherent risk questions and map your input answers to control. So we wanted to be able to take the data from your FFIEC CAT and be able to apply it. The way we did that, over on the right-hand side of the screen here, we actually have Reggie Ranger. Reggie is our information security assistant, AI assistant. So essentially what we've done is we built technology for Reggie to be able to take that FFIEC CAT process and then be able to map it back specifically to the controls that are associated from there. So that's kind of the process that we've went through. Now, what's interesting is this process is actually the exact same as the chart that I had in the FFIEC. The only thing that's changed here is the green colors. So the process for the FFIEC CAT is the exact same. First thing you're going to do is you're going to assess your maturity and your inherent risk. You're going to identify the gaps in alignment. You're going to determine your desired state of maturity. You're going to get a plan to attain and sustain. You're going to reevaluate. And again, that good old arrow there. But the process is the exact same. That takes a ton of pressure off of you, both from communications, existing dynamics, et cetera. So how did we do that? First off, Captain August, we didn't just keep the FFIEC CAT the same. That would not have worked in any form or fashion. So what we did is we actually first looked at the inherent risk questions and we said, what's good in there? And actually 27 of the questions actually stayed the same. So we didn't change them. They're a really good way to be able to go quantify. We did change 12 questions. Some of those were questions, some of those were questions and answers, just because they're dated, time's changed. So 12 questions got changed of the 39 that we had in the FFIEC CAT. And then we added 13 new questions. Questions around things like ransomware. Ransomware was not going on. Things like APIs, AI, real-time payments, list goes on. The things that have kind of structurally changed in our technologies and the way we're doing delivery from an overall standpoint since 2017. It's been a while. So as part of that, what that allows us to do is to keep the least through most process. So essentially the experience of this, and I'm going to go through a demo here at the end today to kind of give you a perspective or a feel, is very similar to what you went through before. Essentially, you're going to have the same questions and processes. We've added those new ones. We've changed the questions. When we do the data import for the questions that stayed the same, those 27 questions, you'll actually see the last year results, and you can basically select those. And you'll notice as you go through, your answers then will give you that same least through most ranking. So the inherent risk process is the exact same. It's just different questions to make it accurate based on today's technology landscape and world. The next thing we worked on was the controls. So the controls essentially are the maturity statements. So if you're still haven't made a decision on what you're going to go do, in the 500 questions, the majority of those questions on the maturity statement were the things that are things you have in place, or attestation questions. I'm going to go say, yes, I'm doing these things, or yes, with compensating controls. And the goal of that process was really for you to be able to go in, document your controls or the processes you have to keep your institution secure. So what we did is we actually took the CIS controls and we added the FFIEC controls. That was the kind of initial version of the control mapping. And the FFIEC controls that we added are things you need to have as a financial institution that the CIS controls just kind of out of the box did not have, that you need for banking. When we went through that process, we were actually able to map just under 50% of the controls went back to what you said in your previous FFIEC CAT. So essentially what that means is we went through a process of going and saying, what did you answer on the FFIEC CAT and how does that apply to the control question? So we were able to map those with Reggie Ranger to be able to facilitate. To make all that work, we created 3 maturity categories: standard, intermediate, and advanced. And based on the process of going through your inherent risk profile, we were then able to kind of align the process from there. So the way this process works, and again, I'm going to show you in the demo in here in just a second. Essentially, the controls, you're able to go in and say yes or yes with compensating controls. Again, there's this data import where we're able to go back and say, as I click on this link here, this is the link to the ability for you to know what is this tied back to in the FFIEC CAT. You'll see your previous year answers. Now, the way we do that data import, we just need to have a PDF or an Excel spreadsheet. And then we'll basically, Reggie will run through, he'll be able to correlate it, be able to give us the answers, and then he'll help us map those back to the specific answers. So in this case, I'm just going to read this. In the FFIEC CAT that you answered for the last several years, but for sure the last time you did the FFIEC CAT, you'll see it says an inventory of organizational assets, e.g. hardware, software, data, and systems hosted externally is maintained. So that's the question. And last year you said yes with mitigating controls. On the FFIEC CAT, the question is establish and maintain a detailed enterprise asset inventory. That directly maps, and that's the same process. So what you're able to go do is you're able to look and say, well, what did I say last year based on the characteristics of that question? It makes the answering process a lot easier as you're going through that scenario. And again, just under 50% of the control questions directly map back to the FFIEC CAT, making that process easier for you to implement. So again, the process is the exact same. You're going to go through and you're going to assess your inherent risk. You're going to identify your gaps. You're going to say, where do I want to be? What level? You're going to get a plan to attain and sustain that. And then you're going to reevaluate with that arrow that just doesn't end. I know that's the dynamic associated with information security governance and banking, is there's always another thing that's coming back up and through the process. So the way this looks from a platform perspective, you'll go through and answer those inherent risk questions. Again, you'll end up being least to most. Just like before, when you're sitting in minimal, you're able to go through, or if you're sitting in moderate, you know, hey, I've got to be at least intermediate. So you have a way to be able to kind of chart and graph the things associated and know. And really what the goal of this was is, this is actually I love to go do hikes, and this is a hike not too far from my house. And this is a gorgeous sunset from the hike that I've got that I go. It's called Indian Seats, just north of Atlanta. And really what our goal or our target was to be able to go take this concept of the anxiety or the stress of the sunset of the cat and actually make it feel like what this does, you know, calming, peaceful. You know, sunsets are not stressful and intimidating. It's really designed in our design, and our target has been to be able to go through that. So I'm going to jump in and actually go through a little bit of a demo. I want to reiterate that as I'm going through this process, the chat is a great way to ask questions as I'm going through. But I know a lot of times being able to kind of see in action how the platform works is a good way to go through. So I'm just going to go click on assessments, and I'm going to go down to the FFIEC CAT. And again, the process that we'll go through, the first experience, or what we call first use at FFIEC, is we'll actually take your previous FFIEC CAT and we'll import it in. That's a big time savings on the process. And the first thing that we're going to go through is you would answer your inherent risk questions. So delivery channels, you're able to go in, and the experience is pretty straightforward. You'll notice as I'm selecting these, the things will change. I'm just going to make all these significant. So you'll see that ranking then just changed. The existing questions or the previous questions that you had that stay the same, there's a data import for that we have those. The ones that are new or changed, you'd have to answer. But straightforward in process, right? It really allows for you to be able to go through and say, and ultimately, when you think about your institution, we know that the characteristics of your institution really create your inherent risk, not just your size or not your impact to the industry. So that's the kind of foundational difference, is keeping this really, again, inherent risk focused. So again, straightforward process. You can select each of these based on the characteristics of your institution. That then populates, if I go back over to here, it puts your rating based on that risk profile in least through most, just like what you have with the FFIEC CAT. You'll see down here, you still have delivery channels, you still have external threats, online mobile, organizational characteristics, and technology and connection types. Those are the same as what you had before. We added a new section called emerging technologies, which addresses some of the processes or the questions that we've added to the institution inherent risk, as we were talking through that earlier. So again, first step, same process that you went through with the FFIEC CAT. The next process is the controls. And the controls, I didn't mention this before, but we started with CIS. You also have the opportunity to do NIST plus FFIEC controls. So you can do either or. Most of our institutions have still chosen the CIS and FFIEC combined controls just because they're easier, they're more prescriptive, and you always have an upgrade path in the future. But we wanted to make sure that you have flexibility in that just as we go through and talk through. So as part of this, really what you're going to notice is now I'm inside of the controls, and what we're able to go through and be able to go define is what are the questions associated and what are those processes from there. So you'll notice you can essentially go in and say yes or no, or yes with compensating controls. You can do comments, you can attach some files. But the big thing I want to be able to show you here is this linkage to the FFIEC CAT. So this was that example I was talking about before, where there's an inventory of organizational assets. You said yes. Again, the design of this is really to make it where you can go through and be able to answer those. So as I kind of go click through these, you'll see the processes kind of associated where you can actually go through and see where these things are linked in the process, and those scenarios going back to that mapping, and being able to see what you have associated. So that design makes it easier. There's also an ability for you to filter. So if you want to just see standard, makes it obviously a lot less intimidating. And just for context, I'm going to go scroll through and see the controls, because this is nowhere near the complexity of the 500 controls that you had back in the FFIEC CAT. So there are 18 sections. I'm on 12 here. You'll notice you have anywhere from 3 to, on the high end, 8 to 10 control questions for those categories. We did add one extra one, which is section 19. These are off FFIEC specific on cybersecurity oversight, which again goes to those banking specific controls. But the complexity of this is not nearly what you were thinking when you had to go through the FFIEC CAT. And really consistently what we've seen is this from start to finish is taking a couple of hours, 2 to 3 hours to go through. And that includes the data import, the training, the process of answering the questions, presenting to your board, et cetera, from there. So there's a tremendous efficiencies being saved just in the way we've kind of structured this. And a lot of it goes back to the same process, the data import and the scenarios associated. So at the end of the day, then you actually have the results and the process. You have a report that you can take to your team to be able to kind of see exactly where you stand. And then you have the executive summary associated. So I'm going to pause right there. If there are any questions, I'm going to go back and hit my presentation. So I'll wait for just a second. And as I'm kind of talking through this, really what we're trying to be very intentional around is this concept of taking these processes and making them easier for you to implement across the board. So we have this philosophy at FFIEC, and a lot of this is leveraging Reggie Ranger, our information security assistant, of don't repeat yourself or dry. And then everything being one click away. And that creates this kind of ease of use. And I wanted to paint a picture for you on the overarching strategy of where the cybersecurity assessment tool ties in. So essentially what we've been able to go do is we talked about the mapping of the controls, the importing of the data, but essentially you can also upgrade and automate your risk assessment by leveraging those same controls and leveraging your inherent risk questions. Now, the way that we do that is we actually have a system map or a system inventory of all of your banking applications, all of your business functions, all of your technology functions. But we know what are the processes that you're doing. So, what are you using for core? What are you using for e-statements? What are you using for item processing, right? Does both the vendor and the system. And then down here, we're also documenting, is it in-house? Is it cloud? Does it contain PII? Does it have an individual login? So we're really being intentional around that process. And from there, what we're able to then go do is apply those controls specifically. So when you fill out the FFIEC cybersecurity assessment tool controls, the controls for the automating the risk assessment are the exact same. So you do those once, you get credit, and you don't repeat yourself, that dry methodology that I was talking through. So essentially what ends up happening, you fill out the system map, you do the controls, and then all of a sudden your risk assessment is automated. And that's a lot of the lens that we're looking through, is just how do we make it where you don't have to do the repetitive entry, you don't have to do the manual effort. And if you think about what you're doing in your world, there's a lot of things that are kind of in that category associated from there. So from there, I'm actually going to open it up for any questions. It looks like, actually, Frank, it looks like you had a question. I'm just going to kind of repeat this so everybody's got it. So the question was, is there a section where you can assign control testing? So essentially, there's a couple things that we have in here. I'm going to hedge, and I'm going to tell the story. So I started my career a little over 25 years ago as an engineer. And I love to say right after that, they found out. So I was actually essentially setting up networks for banks forever ago. I love to say they ran me out because I wasn't technical, which is so true. So hopefully as I go through this, my demos and everything are working. I think I've got the right screen shared. So essentially what we have is a couple of different things that kind of hit on that challenge. The first piece that you can do is you can add comments. Those comments are going to be mapped by the person that actually does the comments. So you have the ability of being able to do that. You can also go through and see a comprehensive history on anything that was changed associated with the process. And then you can also set a date that was reviewed. So the process associated from there is the ability for you to be able to go in and have kind of a complete control log. You can have documentation of that. So a lot of times what we'll see is there'll be a description of who's responsible for that, the details of actually how you go pull the control, what the reports are, what the process is. We'll also see attachments. So you have the ability of also adding and attaching files to each individual specific control. So the kind of the macro of really kind of the root of kind of, or the heart of what your question is, what I typically see is I want to be able to go make sure I have a documentation trail and be able to say who's got these pieces, et cetera. So it may be your managed service provider is the person that's responsible for those things. And you could even upload their catalogs. It could be a scenario where it's a team member is specifically responsible, and you can be able to go do that as well. So that's the process or the experience that we're able to go through. The other thing I did not show, but you can also put documentation on your compensating controls. So I can basically put, and I can't type. It's so intimidating to type while y'all are watching me, just for the record. But then you'll actually see that then has the process is all kind of saved there as well. So those are what I typically say. I'm Frank, hopefully that answered your question as you were wanting to know kind of the assigning controls and what that process looks like. This assign company controls up here is actually the ability for you to be able to change. So if you wanted to go through and go from CIS to NIST, There's a process. We've actually got a place where Reggie can actually help you as well, kind of in the mapping of that process. So if you started with CIS, again, you have the ability to go do that upgrade map. And again, the overarching change history is another piece that we've seen that's super beneficial. And again, you can export that report on that to see who's changed those pieces and what those things were. And you can do it in a couple of different categorizations. Hopefully that helped. So I'm going to continue to talk. There aren't any other questions that are up here at this point, but kind of the goal of really what today was is to kind of give you a perspective on kind of the way we look at this, what that process is. We've got a couple of ways that you guys can move forward with us, depending on kind of where you are in the journey. If you're an existing customer and you're using any of the information security governance suite, this is actually included. So you just have to go through the process of being able to go through and be able to facilitate. You can get the FFIEC CAT just by itself. So if you're in a place where you're like, I got to figure out what to do, I know I have to do something. I love the idea of not spending a bunch of time on this and keeping the executive reporting the same. You can just select that with us. We've got a couple of different ways that we go through our process. We've got a trial dynamic where you can actually just get a access and see if you want to work with it. If you end up going on the free trial, what ends up happening is you don't get the data import, so you spend a little bit more time. If you go through the normal processes, and we've got a small setup fee to do the data import, it saves you some time, but you have those two options. And we've intentionally priced this and worked through the process to be able to make this as a community bank solution and are having a ton of success kind of going through that. The other questions we typically see is, hey, has it gone through an exam? What are the processes? And the results have just been overwhelmingly positive, both with the customers being able to go present it because you're presenting something that's the same process of what you had before. And the regulators like it because they don't have a way of being able to quantify your risk kind of associated from there. So Bradley asked a question, great question, especially where we sit in August. So his question, I'll just repeat this. What would be the timeline to get signed and complete a CAT assessment? We've actually got our processes built where if you say go, we can get you access within a day. So there's really just a decision on, do you want to do the trial or do you want to go through the process of doing the setup fee? If you go through the setup fee on our side, it takes us a little bit of time to go do the data import, but we can get you access to the system really quickly. And then we've had, this won't shock you, but we've had institutions that are sitting in the dynamics of where we are today. And they're like, hey, I got an exam coming up, or hey, I got an audit coming up, help. And really the infrastructure with the way we've actually designed and developed this, Bradley, really the answer is we have an ability to do this really quickly. From that side. So if you really, the next step that we typically go through is we have a conversation or a discussion with one of our team members to walk you through kind of what the process is, answer any questions, get you a proposal as part of that. So that's kind of what we typically have been doing kind of as the next step as part of that process. Yeah, great question. I should have brought that up, especially with us, with the sunset countdown that we have going on. So yeah, great question. So at this point with my, hopefully I haven't lulled you to sleep. Hopefully I've gotten some good dad jokes, maybe even chuckled a little bit in a perfect world, which is really hard when you're talking about information security compliance. I appreciate your time. I'm going to stay on for about a minute longer to just make sure I answer any questions. But if there aren't any other questions, actually there's a question. So I guess it's Alexi. I hope I said your name correctly. Yeah. So really the next step, Alexi, is on our side. We'll just reach out to you and have a meeting with our team. So I've got several of the folks that can kind of walk you through and just get you comfortable with, hey, here's what we're doing, what that process looks like. I'll get you the numbers and then just timeline proposals as well. So yeah, happy to walk through that with you. And really kind of the next step is just to get a meeting and a conversation with our team to go walk through those pieces. So with that being said, I hope you all have a wonderful day. If you haven't had lunch, have a wonderful lunch. Hopefully you're able to go and you're not just working through lunch. If you're eating lunch, hopefully I was able to keep you entertained. And just know our heart, we just want to help and appreciate y'all joining the conversation today. Have a great rest of the week and we'll talk soon. Cheers. Thanks, y'all. Bye-bye.